Welcome back to Seeds of Revolution, Camus Books and InfoShop's bi-weekly podcast about politics, art, anarchism, and lots of other cool and interesting stuff. Very excited for this week's episode. We have a Camus Collective member and volunteer, Will Sahar Patrick, and Will is going to talk to us about his review of The Dawn of Everything, the doorstop of a book written by David Graeber and David Wengrow. Will, how are you doing, my friend?
I'm doing great. Thanks, Joel.
Could you start by just giving us an introduction? What's your story? What do you do? How you first got involved in anthropology, geography, anarchism, all that good stuff.
Yeah, for sure. So I am Will Sahar Patrick, as you mentioned. I've been a Camus Collective member almost 6 years now. But I think more relevant to this, I am a PhD candidate at the University of Victoria. I'm in the Critical Geographies and Geographic Indigenous Futures Collaboratories in the Geography Department. I'm a political, cultural, and historical geographer who is interested in the intersections between infrastructure, politics, and conflict, especially as it pertains to colonialism and imperialism. My dissertation work focuses on the development of settler society and settler state formation here on the island. And my work traces both the development of settler and European ideas of geography. So, how do settlers think about space and territoriality and how they organize space around themselves and how they organize themselves in space? And then also, the flip side of that is how indigenous peoples understand territoriality, spatiality, and indigenous institutions, organizations, as well as their lifeways and foodways, and how those things shape their environments. So, the indigenous infrastructures as well as the settler ones. And it's through that that I engaged with both uh, European intellectual histories about politics and territoriality, as well as looking at a lot of anthropology and ethnographies around indigenous infrastructures and governance and ideas. So that's kind of where I'm coming at it from. I grew up and I did my graduate work around the Great Lakes in Toronto and land that was governed by the One Dish or Dish with One Spoon treaties between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabeg. And now I live and do my work on the Ilononec or homeland of the Lekwungen and Wasanich peoples. And you know what was particularly interesting to me about Dawn of Everything is that Graeber and Wengrow published prior to the release of the book articles both in journals as well as uh, on popular online media about the Pacific Northwest, and that they were going to include work about the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabeg. So that was particularly cool to me, and I was excited to see. Though I'm sure for those who've read my review, I was a little disappointed.
And we'll get to that in a second. Before we dive into The Dawn of Everything and your review of the book, could you locate David Graeber for us within the context of politics, anarchist politics, cultural criticism, anthropology, geography, because he's been a pretty significant figure, certainly on the left and amongst left intellectuals for more than a decade now.
Yeah, for sure. So David Graeber is an American anthropologist and anarchist activist. His early anthropological work was about Madagascar, um, but I think he really entered the public both through his prominence as a figure in the Occupy movement, as well as publishing Debt: The First 5,000 Years in 2011. He published a couple things after that that's for a public audience, like Bullshit Jobs in 2017 and The Utopia of Rules. Um, but he really distinguished himself as an anarchist activist who's also an anthropologist. He often, in some interviews, he doesn't like being called an anarchist anthropologist, and the reason for that is because he doesn't see anarchist anthropology as a kind of discourse or tradition. He actually wrote a book called The Fragments of an Anarchist Anthropology that came out in 2004, where he, advocates for creating an anarchist anthropology, but he says he's not an anarchist anthropologist in the same way that like there is no social democrat anthropology. The difference here would be that there is a Marxist anthropology or Marxian anthropology. And in interviews, Graeber has said that like Marxism, he sees it as a theoretical discourse of revolutionary strategy. And he points to how Marxists kind of divide themselves around intellectual leaders who wrote a body of work. So you've got Marxists, Leninists, Maoists, Trotskyists, right? Like you have a figure who wrote discourses about revolutionary strategy. Meanwhile, for Graeber, anarchism is an ethical discourse of revolutionary practice. So it's more about the tactics and the organization. And he also sees this in how anarchists organize ourselves into tendencies, right? We have anarcho-communists, anarcho-syndicalists, insurrectionists, mutualists, you know, the list goes on. And what's important about that is, you know, an anarcho-syndicalist, for example, you know, there have been anarcho-syndicalists who have wrote theory and wrote about practices, but there isn't really the connection to an intellectual leader who has created a body of work. It's more about, you know, what is the medium that's being used to build the new world in the shell of the old. And so for him, being an anarchist was more about practice. And you can act like an anarchist without calling yourself an anarchist. So that's why, you know, he put more emphasis on anarchist practice than the anarchist label, though in self-consciously calling himself an anarchist, he's making this move where he's identifying anarchist principles in the actions and in the world that he wants to bring about.
What was he trying to do before we get into the positives and negatives and the, you know, some of the criticisms that I think you really wonderfully and accurately levied against the book? What is a more objective summary of what he's trying to do with the dawn of everything?
So Graeber and Wengrow, and very quickly, you know, Wengrow's an archaeologist. He's written on a variety of things, including the Neolithic, state formation in the Mediterranean and West Asia. But I think his big splash in the public was the dawn of everything. Like he wasn't the same kind of figure that Graeber was. Just to give a bit of a background on him as well. So what they're trying to do is make several interventions to revise the public understandings of prehistory and of our past, but more importantly, where we are in the present, as well as the impacts on the future. So from the outset, they reject the consensus position that prehistoric humans largely lived as egalitarian hunter-gatherers or as foragers for most of the time that we've been around. And instead, they argue that humans have been very imaginative and have been cycling between a diversity of hierarchies that they construct and then more egalitarian systems that they, you know, dismantle the hierarchies into peacefully. And that's an important part. At some point, they argue we became stuck in hierarchy. They argue that Afro-Eurasia or the old world became stuck earlier. And they don't necessarily say how or when we became stuck, but it has to do with losing what they describe as the three freedoms, which I'm sure we'll get to later. So as a part of that, they make a related claim that in North and South America, this cyclical system of the three freedoms was preserved. And it was dialogues between Europeans and particularly charismatic indigenous chiefs, specifically between the Baron de la Hotan and the character Andario, in the New Voyages of North America, which was published in 1703. Um, that inspired this question of the origin of inequality in Europe. And it was this indigenous critique, they argue, that prompted the topic of the 1754 essay competition held by the Academy of Dijon. And the question was, what is the origin of inequality among people? And is it authorized by natural law? Which Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, answered in his second discourse in 1755, which is the discourse on the origin and foundation of inequality among mankind.
Can you tie that into what Graeber and Wengrow seek to address when it comes to the human state of nature? Because I found that part of the book pretty interesting. I mean, their idea that we've been stuck in this Hobbes versus Locke dialectic, and they're trying to step outside of that and say, actually, the origins of humanity, the origin of inequality is not just this either or choice that many of us were taught in school and in freshman philosophy between Hobbes' state of nature and Locke's state of nature.
Yeah, I think what they're more aiming at is the kind of neo-Rousseauian and neo-Hobbesian positions in pop history. So people like Jared Diamond or Yuval Harari, Steven Pinker, Francis Fukuyama, these sort of pop history meta narratives are the things that they're pushing back against. Things like Guns, Germs, and Steel, or the better angels of our nature. Um, that creates these kind of that create these really simple narratives, oftentimes these kind of truest narratives that make sense kind of on the surface as you read them. But when you look back, it's much more complex and much more interesting than that. So they're trying to interject into this conversation more of this diversity, right? Part of the intervention they're making about the past, present, and future is that the world doesn't have to be like this. Humans have existed and created uh, a variety of different political systems, different social systems, different economic systems. We've governed ourselves in a variety of ways, and there has always been change. We've moved between things for a long period of time.
So is it fair to say this is sort of an anti-deterministic book?
Yeah, for sure. I do think this is an anti-deterministic book, though sometimes in their anti-determinism, they're arguing that, oh, it's just human creativity and inventiveness. People can just decide to change their societies, um, which, we do have decisions that we can make, though these decisions are preconditioned on the structures that currently exist, as well as the materials we have to work with, which includes, our forms of subsistence. It includes the environments we live in, the technologies we have. So there are, multiple factors in there, but they are very interested in focusing in on responding to these kind of teleological, stagist, or social Darwinian ideas, right? That, oh, we started off as egalitarian hunter gatherers, then we became chiefdoms, then we became kingdoms, then we became states. And they're saying, well, that, is a way that things have gone. But oftentimes we see oscillations and shifts moving back and forth between different organizations, right? So we're not supposed to look at this as kind of like a pyramid of progress. These are just forms that can be taken, and some forms sort of create the context or conditions to create other forms. So, if you create a kingdom or a chiefdom and you centralize it, you can produce a state from that. But that's not necessary. And that's true. Oftentimes polities that start to centralize fail and collapse or decentralize or fragment. It's not. Yeah.
They seem to spend a good amount of time, or at least vigorously go after the idea that agriculture was as deterministic as human society, as I guess history teaches us that it is. That it was really the settling down of the hunter-gatherers and the development of large-scale sedentary agriculture that sort of set the stage and determined the rest of human history. That seems to be particularly one of their targets for debunking.
We do see a lot of variation in agricultural societies, and there is this narrative that agriculture created, hierarchies or inevitably will lead to hierarchies. In many cases, agriculture did set the stage and create the conditions for hierarchy to emerge. Um, a lot of the material conditions that produced egalitarian hunter-gatherer bands, and there's a lot of variety about, how bands can be egalitarian. There isn't like one template for that. Um, we do see, so when we see the transition to agriculture, we do see, especially hunter-gatherer or egalitarian societies that are contemporary that have transitioned into agriculture, we do see them keeping a lot of their egalitarian institutions into that. Um, so there is the argument to be made that, right, you set up a farm, you don't immediately create manorialism, you don't immediately have serfs and lords. These are processes that take time, though, as critics have pointed out, you know, the agricultural trap that closes slowly may still be a trap. Um, though at the same time, like, yeah, it's not necessarily useful to typify agricultural society as hierarchical society. Something that I really like that they pointed out is oftentimes we conflate complexity with hierarchy. Um, and I think there's a lot of room to discuss very complex systems that are also egalitarian and horizontal. So, can we imagine and have people in the past created agricultural societies that are more egalitarian, more horizontal, more free? Sure. Um, do we have the materials to create those societies again? I would argue we do. We just need a concerted effort to organize to create those societies. Um, but at the same time, we can't dismiss that there are a lot of conditions in agriculture of sedentarism that lean themselves towards stratification and hierarchy.
Now,
Um,
is that causal, or is that a causal relationship or a correlation? Because that's one of the things that I thought was particularly interesting, not only about the book, but about this field and the assumption that agriculture leads to hierarchy, because there seems to be certainly a lot of evidence of correlation, but
hmm,
what has gone, at least from my reading, which is not nearly as complete as yours, what has gone less examined is that necessarily a causal relationship? Or does settled sedentary agriculture lead to other factors, which then are more likely to contribute to the creation of hierarchical societies? Is there a direct line from, the scythe to the throne, or is it much more of an indirect path than perhaps we're taught in school?
a lot of the conversation about state formation and stratification in societies often has to do with both property as well as abundance. So when you have, egalitarian hunter gatherers, everybody more or less has what they can carry or what they can put on an animal, whether it's a dog, like a pack dog, or a horse or a donkey, what have you. So you only have so much that you can bring with you. So individuals and families tend to have a similar amount. Once you start practicing agriculture, agropastoralism, or very intense forms of foraging and hunting or fishing, for example, like the Kwak 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 or Nuchahal of Alahi or the Pacific Northwest, um, you can form an abundance. And some people tend to get more than others. And this follows with certain ideas of property as well. So when you look at farms and you look at land, not all land is necessarily created equal. Now, there are different ways that people in the past have tried to account for this. For example, different usufruct systems where people as a group own the land and they give out use rights to the land. So if you have a group of people, you have a land, you divide the land above with everybody to use. And then if some people are using land and they have an abundance, then it's like, oh, well, you don't need that much land. We're going to, give the use rights from part of your land to other groups. We also see different groups rotating land use. So it's like, okay, you own this plot for this period of time, but then somebody else is going to get it the next period of time. So you have these cyclical systems. You also have systems of redistribution where everybody's working the communal land as a clan. You bring all of the products of it together, and then you disperse it, to people as necessary. So there are a bunch of different ways that agriculturalists historically and even presently have changed their land management system or changed their economic system in order to facilitate, more equal distributions. But, if somebody's working land, it's their land, they create the abundance, they may contribute the abundance to themselves rather than the soil. And, if somebody tries to take their land from them, they may try to rebel. They may try to create a political faction that wants to keep land, and there's a book, The Creation of Inequality by Flannery and Marcus, which engages with similar questions that Graeber and Wengrow engage with. And they argue that, these kinds of political coups or bullies that get together to try to cement or reify hierarchy have happened a lot. Oftentimes they fail. Sometimes they manage to succeed. Sometimes, they're able to maintain stratification. Sometimes they only succeed for a generation or two, then it collapses as everybody kind of gets sick of it. So the creation and maintenance of hierarchy and dominance is a very tenuous and fragile task. And I think what Graeber and Wengrow show is that, these systems, both egalitarian systems as well as hierarchical systems, need to be constructed and maintained. And yeah, people can change those things. I don't necessarily agree with their operations for how they change, but that would be more talking about their three freedoms.
What else did they get right before we talk about maybe some of the things that they were more inaccurate about?
I think everybody, all of the critics and reviewers, regardless of where they fall on the rest of the book, this is a monumental tome. It has introduced anthropology to a large body of the public who probably haven't read an anthropology book before and won't read another anthropological archaeological book before. I'm sure it's introduced anthropology and archaeology to a lot of people who want more. They want to look at more books and see more arguments and engage with this more deeply. I do think it succeeded in expanding people's horizons, in seeing what has been possible in the Tea, which is kind of a locally produced magazine. Crawford Killian, the author of the review, was really excited about how the builders of Stonehenge preferred to gather hazelnuts and stuff like that, and instead of doing agriculture. He also thought that the equitable housing situation in Tenochtitlan that the authors discussed was exceptionally interesting. And yes, I think that's all really cool that people can look at these and see the variety of systems that people have lived in throughout history is very important, especially because there's this malaise or this sort of preeminent idea of late stage capitalism, capitalist realism, this idea that, we cannot see beyond the capitalist future. It's easier to see the apocalypse and the end of the world than it is the end of capitalism. And to be fair, I think for a lot of people, the end of capitalism may be the end of the world as they know it. It is kind of apocalyptic. Um, and so that's why it's useful. And I've recommended it to people. You know, I gave it to my dad as a present. I've recommended it to friends. I've gotten it for people. I do think that it is an important book in the conversation.
And it's very
Um,
hopeful, which is one of the things I liked about it the most, was how they, over the, more than 650 pages of the book, Graeber and Wengrow seem, despite discussing the rise and fall and sometimes apocalyptic demise of ancient civilizations, they do seem hopeful for
Mhm.
humans' ability to adapt and change and to create systems of social organization for the betterment of all, not just for the betterment of a few. And I really
Mhm.
enjoyed that part of the book, or at least that vibe of the book.
Mhm.
What what do they get wrong? Where do they miss? And I know that this is a big focus of your review, where they, maybe despite their best efforts, got the history wrong, got the anthropology wrong.
Yeah. I mean, there have been a lot of very knowledgeable critics from different fields who have engaged with different pieces because this is kind of a mammoth book.
Mhm.
And when people read it coming from different specializations, they're going to see uh, their own, they're going to be able to judge what was gotten right from their own expertise. So there have been some reviewers who have seen what has been discussed about their archaeological site or their period, and they've said, "Oh, hey, this is good. I feel like this represents our work pretty well." And then there have been others who have looked at it and said, this misrepresents sources. It skews the examples. It leaves a lot of things out in order to make the point they want to make. Um, and that's where my perspective comes in from doing, the political, cultural, and historic geography, particularly for turtle islands like North America.
And before
As
before you get to that point, Will, just one more general question. When it comes to, significant works of anthropology or geography or archaeology, how common is it for people to cherry pick? When we talk about Graeber and Wengrow cherry picking their sources and their case studies, is that a serious offense, or is that an offense that a lot of academics will commit in order to make their larger point?
So I think there's a distinction to be made between academic publications and then pop, anthropology.
Sure.
Um, for pop anthropology, I mean, some of the books they're responding to, like Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond and Collapse, the other books that he's written, are notorious for very bad history and anthropology and geography. Um, most geographers and anthropologists don't engage with like Guns, Germs, and Steel because there's no there's no premise to engage with. It's how do you engage with something that is wrong on so many fronts. So, as a book of like pop anthropology, it does better than its peers. Um, uh, I don't think it's really comparable to anything like Guns, Germs, and Steel. Though when we talk about anthropology that's written for and history and political science that's written for more of a public audience, like I mentioned, Flannery Marcus's The Creation of Inequality. Since the publication of Dawn of Everything, Nancy Lindisfarne and Jonathan Neal, so an anthropologist and a historian, have written the book Why Men, talking about the rise of inequality through discussing patriarchy and gender, which is something that Graeber and Wengrow hint at but don't really get into. There's a book by the journalist Angela Saini called The Patriarchs on the Origins of Inequality, which also I think does a really good job. And these books engage with the sources, um, discussing very similar and sometimes the same cases as Graeber and Wengrow do, but do so in a more with more veracity and more rigorous leaning towards the text. And I think the creation of inequality and why men and the patriarchs are made for a popular audience. So it's certainly something that you can do. Um, it's just a different, um, you know, method or pedagogy that you go into reading, writing the book with.
So it sounds like Graeber and Wengrow did well, but they could have done better.
Yeah, there's definitely, a hint of like sensational revisionism here, right? Like they want to revise things, but they're trying to be very sensational about it. They're trying to make a narrative that is exciting and compelling. And to be fair, I think they do. They do make archaeological sites very exciting. Um, I think we had Netflix. Graham Hancock, who came out with his series about, Atlanteans, creating all these ancient sites, which is pseudoscience, it's conspiratorial and nonsense. And I think it's a shame when, it is pseudo anthropologists or archaeologists that introduce sites to people because like these sites deserve to be talked about. They, deserve to have um the various academics and researchers behind them properly spotlighted with citations and engaging with their work in an earnest and sincere way. Uh, and I think it was just awful that a lot of people got introduced to archaeology through Hancock and they got excited in all the wrong ways. So, Graeber and Wengrow get people excited in archaeology and anthropology, I think, in a right way. Like they're, I don't necessarily agree with some of the presentations of the sources or the way that they engage in some of the cases by leaving certain things out. Um, but it's definitely a step above a lot of the other um, engagements that with archaeology or anthropology that people could be having right now.
Let's turn to the three freedoms and the focus of your critique. Could you tell us, because that's a significant portion of the book, it
Mhm.
sort of is what they're driving towards is the elucidation of these three freedoms and their place in the history of civilization. Could you talk to us about what those three freedoms are and where Graeber and Wengrow maybe, I don't want to say misused, but perhaps misunderstood historical sources in advancing this significant thesis?
Yeah, of course. Early on in the book, Graeber and Wengrow dismiss the analytical the usefulness of terms like equality and inequality. Um, so they say it's like, oh, well, how would you judge if a society is unequal? Societies have different things that they value. Like, do you talk about religious inequality, political inequality, wealth inequality? And so, they either, kind of dismiss it through, I would say, an absurd degree of relativism, or they give it this kind of qualitative sameness. Um, because different cultures have different notions of what should be equal. So how do we measure these things? And there are many theorists, political scientists, sociologists, geographers, anthropologists who have come up with ways to measure equality and inequality. And there's always going to be some sort of lack. There's always going to be something that these um, qualitative or quantitative ways of measuring inequality miss. But they at least, put something together and put it out there to measure it, to make an argument, and then other people can critique them. Um, and a big thing for Graeber and Wengrow is that they're not really concerned with wealth inequality or social stratification, right? Like they think that societies that have absolutist monarchs who can kind of kill people with a whim can have freedoms, like the three freedoms that I'm going to get into. So it's a very interesting place for them to start when talking about, egalitarian or free societies. So instead of judging whether a society is equal or unequal based on some criteria, they instead have three key substantive freedoms: the freedom to move, the freedom to disobey, and the freedom to change social relations.
And
All
sorry, Will, but before you explain those, is that even a useful metric? Like, is substituting equality and inequality for the idea of three freedoms, whether or not they get those three freedoms right from a historical or anthropological perspective, intellectually, do you find that useful when approaching this sort of history and prehistory?
personally, I don't find, the dismissal of wealth inequality or social stratification as ways of judging or analyzing societies as equal or unequal is particularly useful or robust, because that's often the conception of what equality is. Like, is everyone able to participate in society together, uh, on the same terms? If some people are able to participate more because they have more stuff, or if some people are able to uh, participate because of a certain political stratified class that they have, while others are not, those are pretty prime ways that we determine whether or not a society is equal. Um, and they'd have to do a great deal of work to establish why they consider certain kinds of property or wealth inequality or certain kinds of social stratification to be um, equal or unequal. Um, and I do agree with them that there are certain non-state or stateless societies that have roles like oftentimes we just refer to sort of broadly to indigenous leadership as chiefs, even though these were not like necessarily hierarchical positions. So yeah, if you have a leader in a group and that leader has to form consensus in order to get anything done, that leader, is much different than a leader who is an elite who rules with an iron fist and enforces their policies or their will upon people through violence or coercion. These are very different modes of politics. So I do think, they get that right by pointing that out, though, to talk about the freedom to disobey, which we'll get to in a second, compare those and have those two kinds of societies kind of comparable, I think really misses the mark. And before I get into these two, talking a little bit about what a substantive freedom is, uh, they make a distinction between, the kind of economic freedoms that we have today and their substantive freedoms. So if I, living in Victoria, wanted to go to Vancouver, I could very well do that, but only insofar as I can afford to. So I'd have to pay for, the transit and the transport, ferry ticket, plane flight, what have you. I'd have to pay for a hotel. I'd have to pay to eat out. I'd have to pay for all those things. Um, Meanwhile, for a substantive freedom, there would be uh, codified social institutions, relationships, networks, organizations that would facilitate the travel. So I would be able to get from Victoria to Vancouver because I would be a part of a larger network that is obliged to help people travel and host people. We do kind of have that today, right? Like if a family member, if you're on good terms with family members, they want to come visit you, I think there's an unspoken sort of etiquette that you are obliged to host them, if
Mhm.
at all necessary, right? Like, oh, you're going to come over, you're going to come over. I have enough space so you can sleep, on my pull-out couch. But that is, and I do think that is a remnant of these much more robust social systems we used to have based on more extended family or clan based societies. But today, it's more of a vestigial system that's often, just within the domestic sphere.
It's much more materialist, and Graeber
Yeah,
and Rowe are approaching it from a much more, anti-materialist perspective.
yeah. So if we're talking about a substantive freedom or talking about these social freedoms, they do give examples that I think fit with these substantive freedoms. So for the first one, they have the freedom to move, which again, a lot of these are amorphous. They give different phrasings for these freedoms every time they use them. So they have the freedom to move away and relocate, or to abandon one's community, knowing they'd be welcomed in faraway lands, which I think is a little far fetched. Um, and they use different cases, sometimes very distinct cases that have different material structures and things happening to fit into these freedoms. So on the one hand, you know, there are societies that have a substantive freedom to move elsewhere, like with egalitarian hunter-gatherers. Very oftentimes, when there's tension within a group, one person or one party in the group can leave that group and go to another group where they have relatives or friends. And this is both for social tensions. So if you have a disagreement with somebody in your egalitarian hunter-gatherer group, and you're having arguments, one of you can get up and go to another group nearby where you have relatives or friends, cousins, what have you, and they'll accept you and you can live there. This also works with other kinds of tensions, like if you have a bad season and food isn't as productive, perhaps there isn't enough game to hunt in, the area of your local group, then people from that local group can go to other neighboring groups and kind of lighten the load on that area, go to more productive areas. So these kinds of networks serve different functions. We also have the example that they use of the Algonquian and Iroquoian peoples of the Great Lakes region, of the Dish with One Spoon treaty region. And clans do play a very important role in governance, as well as function as a bit of a traveler's aid society. Though this is very circumscribed. So if you are a part of a clan, your clan has a territory, or your clan is a part of a sort of broader group that has a territory that you can move within. And if you wanted to move to other territories that are a part of your nation, then that has to be negotiated with the other clans, and if you want to move between territories of nations or of peoples, that is negotiated between them through treaties. So it's not like, I am part of a clan as a part of this group of people. I'm going to go to another nation's land. It's not, it's not necessarily
unfettered freedom.
Right. Like they may be like, no, we're at war. Like we fight you. Like, why are you here? And that's why, the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Treaty is so important, because it was an agreement to share lands between their kind of core territories, and make sure that those lands were not exhausted, and to use them responsibly. And oftentimes these treaties would be renewed on a cycle, whether it was a yearly cycle or, one that was longer. So these are like political engagements and agreements that would be made. So then the question is, how different is that than other ways of people? How quantifiably or qualitatively different is that from other ways of negotiating, migration or immigration or citizenship and these kinds of things?
We have freedom of movement. What are the other two?
After the freedom to move, there is the freedom to disobey. And this is a freedom that they frame as to disobey authorities without consequence, to disobey orders, or to ignore or disobey commands. And in this, they conflate consensus governance with coercive governance. So for the consensus governance, they talk about the Huron or the Wendat people whose chiefs had to build consensus. They had to make sure that everybody agreed to what was going to happen when creating policies and those kinds of things, when governing. Meanwhile, they also present, for example, the Natchez, which at the period that is writing about, they had the Great Sun, who ruled over kind of a group of semi-autonomous village districts, and each village district had its own sun. What Graeber and Wengrow say is that the commoners of the Natchez Nation were able to disobey the orders of the Great Sun because they lived in other districts. What was actually happening is that each district had its own sun and war chiefs, and those sons would ignore the orders of the Great Sun. And what we actually see is a more complex landscape where you had two factions. The Great Sun and other sons were one faction, and then there was another group of sons that were another faction, and they were actually in conflict with one another. So they were a whole, but at the same time, there was also internal divisions and fractures among them. So they're conflating this kind of consensus governing, where you have to govern through agreement with, the population, with, this internal conflict among elites.
I was just going to say that they seem to miss the elite conflict aspect of this.
An important part about this is that Graeber wrote a book called On Kings with Salons, where a lot of this stuff about, kingship kind of derives from. And in that text, he cites a source, and it's the same source in Dawn of Everything. And he also notes that there is elite conflict in that book on Kings. So from On Kings to Dawn of Everything, we know Graeber knows this, but he has not, included it in the Dawn of Everything. So that's
he's at least de-emphasizing it in service of his larger thesis.
So that's the kind of, slipperiness that's happening with some of the use of sources. We have a similar thing with the freedom to move, right? Like, it's one thing to have a disagreement with somebody and then move to another local group, or if you're in a clan society, you're in your clan, you want to go visit your family, your extended family, so you use your marriage relationships, or use your extended family's clan relationship in order to go visit them and get hospitality. They also use an example of the Osage, and the Osage people lived in like the Middle Ohio River Valley, and they kind of migrated to the Great Plains. They say this is a freedom to move. What they don't mention is that the Osage, in their migration, they were migrating away from constant warfare in the eastern woodlands, on the border of the eastern woodlands, into the Great Plains. And in that migration, they conquered land and expelled the Caddoan people from it. So is that really a freedom? Like, certainly not for the Caddoans.
I was going to say, it's certainly one-sided if it is.
Right. And so, and part of that too, they talk about, indigenous peoples, there was a lot of freedom to move because there was so much empty space. They could just move to empty places. But what that kind of fails to get at is that indigenous peoples had different ways of territorializing space. In the eastern woodlands, which is where, a lot of the Iroquoian peoples lived, and they were the Osage were, indigenous peoples tended to organize space around an agricultural core of villages. So you'd have your villages, and then you'd have your agricultural area with corn and squash and beans. Then on the outer ring, you would have your primary hunting areas where you'd be hunting and foraging. Then there would be an extended area that would be their claimed hunting grounds. And those hunting grounds would be used if, there's ever a bad year and they needed to expand the territory that they need to hunt in. And while this idea of territoriality is a bit more fluid, it was still enforced. And indigenous peoples would go to war over maintaining these territories. And if somebody encroached too close to their claimed hunting grounds, they could fight over it. And that's what was happening with the Osage. So it's like these primary and claimed hunting grounds were also purposefully kept unsettled or minimally settled. So in the primary or claimed hunting grounds, you would have bands moving through seasonally, depending on, whether they were foraging, what they were hunting, and then they would come back to the central villages at other seasons. depending on, the foodways and the subsistence systems of those people. Um, so just to kind of gloss over how indigenous peoples organize their own territoriality, it's like, yes, there was a lot of so-called empty space, but that was purposeful in order for their land management system to function the way that it did.
And what is the third freedom?
The third freedom is probably the most amorphous and the most messy of them. And the authors kind of interchangeably reference this as the freedom to create new and different forms of social relationship, to shift back and forth between social structures depending on time of year, to rearrange your social ties, to reorganize your social relationships, and to like build new social worlds. And they do a lot with this. On kind of the more reasonable end, they have marriage and adoption. So when you marry someone in a clan society or in other societies, you now have obligations and duties to your extended family, but they also have duty to you. So, you have changed your social relations. The same thing with adoption. If a nation or people like the Wendat people, they adopted another group of people and adopted them into the nation, made them their own clan. Uh, you know, that changes social relations. Though, some of these I would argue is like, okay, we still practice forms of migration. Well, we don't practice clan adoption. Like adoption is still kind of a thing. That's one side. On the other end is this they use examples of cities going from hierarchical to egalitarian forms. They use Taosi in China, contemporary China, as well as Teotihuacan in contemporary Mexico to kind of talk through this. So in Teotihuacan, it's is kind of founded as a city in 100 BCE, and it's kind of stops being used as a settlement around 600 CE, or as Graeber and Wengrow give those numbers. Initially, Teotihuacan had a lot of monumental temple building. It was pretty stratified within like the urban planning, as well as whenever one of these temples were built, there were huge mass sacrifices. So, somebody was sacrificing somebody else. And, we can talk about the kind of domination and inequality that existed in society, in that society. However, around 300 CE, there is a change. There is a change in the urban landscape where different dwellings start to be built in a more equal fashion. So people start living in equal or in more equal sized dwellings. People have access to more similar things. However, this happens at 300 CE around the same time that the Temple of the Feathered Serpent is vandalized. It is physically damaged. It is burned, and after that, temple building stops. So we do have this kind of revolt, evidence of a revolt or a rebellion that happened within Teotihuacan during that period of time that kind of signals this transition. Same thing with Taosi. You had a similar, hierarchical situation, sacrifices, mass burials. But then, and Taosi was between 2300 BCE and 1800 BCE. So around 2000 BCE, so 300 years in, you have, the demolishing of the walls, the commoner quarters kind of expand and take over most of the city. Elite grave sites are mixed in with commoner grave sites. So, you used to have elite cemeteries, but now commoner graves are in those cemeteries. So something very dynamic happened. And Graeber and Wengrow even suggest that there's probably some degree of violence that occurred in that transition. And I would argue, well, then that's not really substantive, right? Like, if you need to overthrow the social order that you're living in, in order to create a more egalitarian world, that's not really enacting your freedoms.
The very loose definition of freedom.
Right. You're definitely enacting a freedom and you're seizing a freedom. But in that case, I would argue, did we lose this? Right? Like we regularly have, upheavals and ruptures and protests all over the world against, hierarchies and, those elites and the various organizations and institutions that they employ to dominate the rest of society are mobilized to defend them. Sometimes
it's certainly not a freedom that is an intrinsic part of the society. Quite the opposite. Yeah. It's a freedom that's being exercised despite society's most coercive intent to control a population, to stifle that very which eventually bubbles up or blows up.
Yeah, and this point where these transitions are peaceful is important because Graeber and Wengrow, in an article that came out prior to the dawn of everything, were citing Teotihuacan specifically in response to Walter Scheidel's book, The Great Leveler, where he argues that, look, we tend to see leveling of wealth inequality after some devastating violent events, which are state collapse, plague, industrial warfare, and violent revolutions. It's like that's when we tend to see wealth level, like people become more equal. And I think one of the questions that Scheidel is kind of asking is, why have all of these like peaceful regulatory policy solutions to inequality, why have they failed? Like why does violence and sort of the violent redistribution of wealth and power in society seem to be the only thing that kind of works? And Graeber and Wengrow are responding, well, no, there are examples of people changing their social worlds without violence. And, in the examples that they give, at least, that doesn't seem to be the case. And then between these two, so between marriage and adoption and violently overthrowing elites, we have societies that kind of switch back and forth between hierarchical and egalitarian modes, depending on time of year. And their kind of poster case for this is the equestrian bison hunters of the Great Plains, and they reference in particular the Cheyenne. And as they explain it, the Cheyenne live most of the year in egalitarian, like anarchistic bands, and then in parts of the year they gather together, form a police force, create chiefs, and govern themselves as like a hierarchical system until the bison hunting season ends. And then they redistribute, and then they kind of dismantle these hierarchies and go back to living in an egalitarian system. Though, from my perspective, that really misinforms people about the governance structures of the Cheyenne. So the Cheyenne had 44 chiefs called Veho'o in their ancestral governance system, and they existed year-round. So each band, had its own chief. And also, these police forces, quote unquote, were warrior societies, the Notehe'o. And these warrior societies existed all year round, and they had duties that they performed, whether in small bands or in larger groups. They facilitated ceremonies and great hunts. They had policing power that they rotated between them. And they also facilitated traveling. So they protected people when they were on the move, as well as when they were in the villages. The, I think, key factor here is the bison themselves. So bison, during most of the year, live in smaller herds. So you have bachelor herds where groups of bulls will travel together. And then you also have herds where cows and their young will travel together. For the rut during the summer, so, from kind of August to September, the bachelor herds and the, cow and young herds, calf herds, come together for the rut. And this is because, this is the time of year where the most forage is available. And so you have large amounts of food available. You have these huge herds of bison that are coming together for the mating season. And because all of the primary food source of the Cheyenne is concentrated, the Cheyenne Nation can also come together. And when they come together, it's not that they're building, a police force and that they're building up a sort of chieftain system of governance. It's that they have it all year round. They have chiefs and they have the warrior societies all year round. It's just happening at a much larger scale than it usually is, or at least a more concentrated amount than it usually is. Cheyenne scholar Leo K. Kilsbeck describes, the distribution of powers between these two institutions as highly organized and built and foundational to both Cheyenne principles and vice versa. So when Graeber and Wengrow are talking about the Cheyenne system of governance and referring to them as play chiefs and play police arrangements, that really belittles the intentionality of Cheyenne governance. And they don't oscillate between this hierarchical system in one part of the year and this sort of egalitarian system in another part of the year. It exists all year round. There is a continuity of governance. And of course, the Cheyenne chiefs operate on consensus. So the Cheyenne chiefs create consensus and agreement among their bands. And then when they all come together, they create consensus among all the bands. And then, of course, the warrior societies who cyclically take responsibility for making sure everyone agrees to the consensus decisions of the entire nation are, I think, have created a wonderful institutionally organized system where, the people who are doing the so-called policing and keeping the peace know full well that another group of people are going to be doing it at another time. So I think that, this kind of moderation, and at the same time, everything that they are, you could say that they are policing are in fact agreements that the community came to by consensus. It's not as though, a king or a government that, we may have some involvement in, but we don't, people in Canada as citizens don't, get to decide on the laws. That's something done by representatives. The representatives decide a thing, and then the police enforce it upon us. That's very distinct from how the Cheyenne operated. And the way that Graeber and Wengrow talk about it kind of takes away all that complexity and all of the interesting material that anarchists and people who want to build complex, egalitarian, equal societies can, think about when, considering societies in the future.
Again, sort of leveling history just for the sake of the thesis.
Yeah. And something that's really important is that, when they talk about the Cheyenne, they cite Lowy, who's an anthropologist who did ethnographic work and, wrote articles and books about the Cheyenne and other equestrian bison hunters. But they don't cite any more recent work. Leo Kilsbeck's book came out, before the release of the book, but probably too soon for them to incorporate his work in particular. But other, Cheyenne knowledge keepers have been interviewed by anthropologists. Anthropologists have, non-Indigenous anthropologists have published about a variety of equestrian bison hunters. They could have looked at a broader range of work. And in addition, like Lowy, even in the work they cite, talks about how the warrior societies exist year round. They're very selective with the sources they use, picking Lowy, which is very old by this point, and also not selecting any recent scholarship by, any Indigenous or non-Indigenous theorists. And that's where it kind of falls flat for me talking about these freedoms.
I'd like to end on your analysis of that essay contest that Rousseau won,
Mm-hmm.
how much they hang their hat on a particular Wendat chief and what they think his influence on the French Enlightenment and Western political evolution was, because that's a pretty significant part of the book. And in your review, you have some pretty foundational challenges to Graeber and Wengrow's account of that.
Yeah, I think that their characterization of Europe in particular as being a place that could not even consider equality in the late medieval and early modern period to be greatly overstated. So in the book, they say, the question of inequality would have, baffled medieval and early modern Europeans, which simply is not the case. We have many examples of medieval and early modern people talking about inequality, where it came from, and how it happened or why it happened. And for them, especially for the peasants who are revolting against it, it was always, we were made equal. Certain people took it from us through violence and coercion, like that. And whether this comes from a sort of religious position, which it often did in the medieval period. So John Ball, who was a priest and a prominent rebel in the English peasants' revolts in 1381, his question was, if God wanted to make, some people better than others, if in the Garden of Eden, was Adam or was Eve, the serf or the noble? And then he, kind of ended his speech with saying, like, throw off the yoke of oppression and seize your own liberty. So, we have a clear understanding there of equality, inequality, and seizing your natural liberty.
And a revolutionary tradition.
Yeah. And this is later taken up. Wengrow responded to this. In particular, philosopher Kwame Anthony Appiah wrote a review where he pointed out John Ball, as well as several other examples from the late medieval and early modern period. And Wengrow kind of shifted it then to, oh no, we're not talking about the origin of inequality, which, to be fair, they certainly do in the book. He specifies the question as he wants to talk about the origin of the question of inequality and why intellectuals came to a consensus that this was an important question to ask for the 1754 Academy of Dijon essay competition. And then, my response to that would be, we can look at people like Etienne de la Boétie, who was a friend of Montaigne. Boétie is a magistrate, judge, theorist, and poet living in 16th century France. And he, after his death, his posthumous work, The Discourse on Voluntary Servitude, was published, where he speaks entirely within, natural law. So he's like, people are naturally free. God doesn't really come into it for him. And a very important question for him is, how did naturally free, liberty-loving people become shackled with hierarchy? And this is a vital question for him. And he's writing this. Oftentimes it's dated between. So it oftentimes the dating for this is probably when he was around 18 to 22 years old. So he's in university. But there we have 22-year-olds French intellectual who's thinking about this. And what's important about that is Graeber and Wengrow pin this indigenous critique to the Baron de Lahatan's dialogue with Endario in The New Voyages to North America, which is published in 1703. So clearly, that dialogue could not have influenced Etienne de la Boétie. And Boétie, when he's writing, he's not citing indigenous peoples of the Americas. He's talking about Venice. How Venice was, when Venice was created as a republic, they would elect a doge, and yearly they would elect 2 consuls, and they would get together in what are called like arengos, which are open gatherings of people to talk about political things in order to do their governance. And the Doge was on a very short leash because, in the first century or so of the Venetian Republic and self-rule, I think only one got away without being exiled, blinded, or assassinated. So the original Venetians took that very seriously, and I think that's, this kind of republic where they elect, a leader and then kind of depose them in this kind of cathartic violence that seems to happen periodically is kind of a living example of this Carnival King ritual that they point to throughout the book. They talk about the Carnival King, people electing the Carnival King and then ritually dethroning them. It's like, well, we have an actual example of that in the early modern period. Over time, of course, certain families in Venice become more powerful. The more democratic character, the egalitarian character of the republic becomes more oligarchic. And Etienne de Beauté says, I'd really like to introduce the original Venetians to the Venetians of the 16th century because they probably wouldn't recognize each other. And this carries forward to Rousseau. So Rousseau, they try to characterize Rousseau as this courtier, who's living in the court, living among the aristocrats. But he was a citizen of Geneva, which was a republic. He was the son of a poor watchmaker. His father walked out on him, and he spent most of his life in poverty and as a servant. When he was writing his second discourse, he was not a young dandy. He was a middle-aged philosopher. And Rousseau in Geneva, he was growing up in a time of great civil turmoil within the city. Prior to his birth, or around the time of his birth, in 1712, there was a pamphlet that was circulated that argued for the citizens of Geneva to seize their natural-born freedoms that they started out with when Geneva was a city. Throughout his youth, there were the democratic movements or the representants who would have periodic rebellions or revolts or plot conspiracies to overthrow the oligarchical small council that was ruling Geneva. That faction was called the Negatifs. And a few years after Rousseau died, in 1780, after Rousseau died in 1782, there was a rebellion and a revolution in Geneva. So that kind of came to a point. The revolution failed, but we do have this political turmoil happening where you have democratic factions throughout Rousseau's life, who occasionally he's associated with, that are fighting to expand franchise so that more people can vote, so that more citizens can be involved in politics, so that more people can become citizens. And this is something that is in Rousseau's own work. So he writes a history of Geneva, and he says, when Geneva was founded, everyone was a citizen, we were all equal, and, we self-governed. And now there are certain people who have more property than others, and they're ruling over us. So we can talk about Rousseau's political thought within his own political context. We can also talk about him in response to the theorists he was responding to and critiquing. We all, know about Hobbes. So Hobbes himself was writing Leviathan in response to the English Civil Wars, which was when the parliamentarians fought against the royalists. And it's from this we get groups like the Levelers. And the Levelers were also arguing for increased franchise and voting. And we know that they actually delivered these demands to people like Oliver Cromwell and Thomas Fairfax and Henry Ireton, because there were the Putney debates where there were regiments in the parliamentarian army who elected agents or agitators to present their political grievances to their officers and their generals. So, when we're asking, why did the intellectuals of Europe think this was something to ask? Well, for the past few centuries, everyone had been thinking about it. Um, and so Hobbes was writing, okay, we can't have parliamentarianism. We can't have these kinds of representative modes. We need to have a very strong, centralized, absolutist form of monarchy. There were a, political theory. There was a political theory that responded to this that was called the doux commerce, or the sweet commerce. And their response was, we agree that uh, society civilizes people, but they disagreed that it needed to be political. So for them, it was commerce and economic and social intercourse that gave men, they're talking about men, virtue and gentleness and civilization. So it was through economic exchange and luxury and property that people became good. And that was very influential in Geneva. And we know through his letters that Rousseau is like talking about these people and responding and critiquing these people. And Rousseau thought that this idea that, people need to be civilized through property and economic exchange was said something pretty negative about human nature and who humans could be. So in Rousseau's second discourse, he creates this speculative thought experiment, which is the savage man. And I think Graeber and Weingart do cite Terrington. There's a book called The Myth of the Noble Savage that came out in 1999, where people often attribute Rousseau as coming up with this idea of the noble savage, but it was not. There was a previous thinker who came up with it, and then in the 19th century, scientific racists said that Rousseau came up with this idea of the noble savage, and it seems just to have stuck. But Rousseau's idea of the natural man, or the wild man, the savage man, is that he's free of all society's vices and virtues. He can't be good or bad because he doesn't have any kind of social relations. And Rousseau also says that this natural man does not exist today and probably never existed. So it's entirely, a thought experiment. So he's not talking about, often he's not talking about any indigenous person in particular. He's just thinking about a human without this kind of doux commerce or absolutist influence civilizing them. And so when we think about the kind of intellectual history of Rousseau, and there are scholars who have done it, I cite one of them, Helena Rosenblatt. Well, I said a couple, but Helena Rosenblatt's a big one for me. We can look at his own political circumstance, and we can also look at him responding to other political theorists who are themselves responding to the political circumstances that they're engaged in. And in that, I don't want to deny that the exchange of ideas between people on the European subcontinent and people in the broader world wasn't important in the development of those ideas. It certainly was, and there's a whole tradition of books that talk about the global Enlightenment and talk about the contact between Europeans and other groups of people. So like On Savage Shores is the most recent book in a series of books that talk about the global intellectual influences on, European thought and how they exchange with one another, including East Asia and the Islamic world. There's undoubtedly influences that indigenous thought had on the development of contemporary, political ideas. I just think it's really important to have that conversation within the broader context, rather than, attributing, Rousseau's work to a specific critique, which we're not clear whether or not he read, and he certainly did not cite. Mm-hmm. So there are some very suggestive leaps that are made in order to make that happen. And in order to make that indigenous critique work, specifically the date of 1703, they have to ignore previous encounters between Europeans and indigenous peoples that I would argue are just as, if not more, impactful on the thinking of Europeans. So you know in doing the kind of work that decolonizes thought, we have to bring the breadth of these discourses and intellectual histories and theories together, to create a more interconnected and kind of global story of who we are as people. And I think Graeber and Wengrow, by fastening the indigenous critique and the preservation of the three freedoms in the Americas, they kind of miss out on that. And for the purpose of their thesis, they have to say that Europe, which was politically, a very diverse place with its own, upheavals, fragmentations, with hierarchies and then more egalitarian organizations, revolts and whatnot. They have to cast that all as, essentially a hierarchical malaise that is uninteresting to us. Which is unfortunate. They were supposed to do, I think, 3 or 4 more planned books. So maybe they would have addressed some of these things. I think Wengrow is planning on publishing more, and with Graeber as a posthumous author from the notes that they made and some of the early drafts. So I'd be really excited to see where they go from here and see if they address or if Wengrow is addressing some of the criticisms of the Dawn of Everything to build a more robust new history of humanity and theory of everything that they're trying to put forward.
And if they do, we will be back for another discussion. Thank you so much, Will. The book is The Dawn of Everything, A New History of Humanity by David Graeber and David Wengrow. We sell lots of copies at Camus Books and Info Shop. Open every day, 10 to 6. Will and I are both collective Camus members. And Will, I can't thank you enough for this conversation and for this great book review. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, it was really great.
Fantastic. I'll see you soon, and stay tuned for our next episode in 2 weeks. Thanks, everybody.